The town of Veldmore sat at the edge of the known world, or at least that was how it felt, when the winter came down from the mountains like a living thing, pressing against rooftops and filling the streets with a silence so complete that even footsteps seemed to apologize for existing. It was a town that had learned to keep its head down, to not ask too many questions about the forest that began where the last streetlight ended, and to smile politely whenever outsiders mentioned the legends. The guide. Legends were for tourists and children, the adults of Veldmore would say, pouring another cup of bitter coffee and changing the subject with practiced ease. The cursed wolf was a story. The disappearances had always been explained. The sounds from the forest at night were just wind, just animals, just the particular way sound traveled through pine trees when the temperature dropped below freezing. Just that. Nothing more. If you said it enough times, you could almost believe it. Almost. Mara. Voss had stopped trying to convince anyone of anything around the age of 16, which was the year her father died, and left her his house, his debts, and 14 leather-bound journals filled with 30 years of obsessive documentation. Before that, she had been the kind of child who raised her hand in school when teachers mentioned local history, who asked follow-up questions that made adults shift uncomfortably in their seats, who drew maps of the forest based on her father's stories and kept them under her mattress like contraband. After her father's death, she became something quieter and more dangerous. A woman who had stopped needing to be believed because she had enough evidence to believe herself. She worked at the town's small heritage archive, cataloging records that nobody ever came to read, and she spent her evenings going through the journals with a systematic patience that would have impressed any academic researcher, cross-referencing her father's accounts with historical records, newspaper clippings, and the handful of scholarly papers about Veldmore's founding mythology that existed in the wider world. She was not crazy. She knew she was not crazy. And she knew that the cursed wolf of Veldmore was not a story. The first disappearance of that particular winter happened on a Tuesday in November, which was unremarkable enough that the town sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Torvald Heiss, who had inherited the position from his own father and treated it primarily as a social obligation, initially filed it under voluntary absence. The missing person was a young man named Fenn, 19 years old, who had been known to hike into the forest alone, and who had a complicated relationship with his family that made the voluntary absence theory plausible enough for official purposes. But Mara noticed the date. She noticed it because her father's journals contained a pattern that she had been tracking for years, a cyclical rhythm of incidents that clustered around specific astronomical events, and the night Fenn disappeared had coincided with the third full moon after the autumn equinox, which her father had called the waking moon in his notes, and had marked with increasing urgency across decades of entries. She pulled out the relevant journal and read the passage she had read 100 times before, her breath misting in the cold air of her small living room, because she kept the heat lower than was comfortable to save money. The entry read, "He does not hunt them. I am more certain of this now than I have ever been. The disappearances around the waking moon are not predation. They are something else entirely. The old woman on the mountain road, the one who would not give me her name but who knew things she should not have known, told me that the beast goes looking during the waking moon. Not for prey, for something it lost, for something it was promised, and then denied. She would not tell me more. She touched the scar, on her own wrist, the one she said had been there since before she was born. And she looked at me the way people look at someone who is standing too close to the edge of something without realizing it. I think she knew who I was. I think she knew about Mara. I think she was warning me. Mara had read those words so many times that she could recite them from memory, but they still made the hair on her arms rise under her sweater. She had been named in her father's journals long before she was born. That was the thing she kept returning to. The detail that made everything else fall into place like a lock finally finding the right key. She allowed herself 3 days of watching and waiting before she did anything that could be characterized as action. In those 3 days, a second person went missing, a woman in her mid-30s named Aldous, who had been a regular at the town's only bar, and who was known to walk home alone after closing time, despite the warnings that had been circulating since Fenn's disappearance. Sheriff Heiss called a town meeting. He used words like precautionary and no cause for alarm and working with regional authorities, which in practical terms meant he had made one phone call to the county office and had been told that 2 missing persons did not constitute a crisis requiring outside intervention. People in Veldmore murmured among themselves and doubled their locks and walked their dogs in pairs and carefully, very carefully, did not mention the forest or the old stories because that would have felt like an invitation, and nobody wanted to invite anything. Mara sat in the back of the town meeting and watched Heiss's face and thought about what her father had written in his final journal entry, the one dated 3 days before he walked into the forest and never came back. I think the beast is not what the curse made it. I think the beast is what the curse imprisoned. There is a difference. There is an enormous difference. I have to go and see for myself. On the 4th day after Fenn's disappearance, Mara put on her warmest coat, the one that had been her father's, and that still carried a faint smell of pine resin and old paper, packed a bag with practical supplies, and her father's most important journal, and walked to the edge of the forest as the sun was going down. She was not being reckless. She had thought this through with the same methodical care she brought to everything. She had left a detailed note on her kitchen table explaining where she was going and why, addressed to her neighbor Petra, who was 70 years old and believed everything Mara told her because Petra had been friends with Mara's father and had her own reasons for taking the old stories seriously. The note included instructions for what to do if Mara did not return by morning. She had her phone fully charged, though she knew from her father's maps that the signal died approximately 400 meters into the trees. She had a flashlight with new batteries and a backup. She had a compass. She was not being reckless. She was being exactly as careful as her father had not been, which was the only way she knew how to honor him. The forest took her immediately, which was the only way to describe what happened when the trees closed around her, and the light from the town street lamps stopped reaching. It was not darkness exactly, because the snow on the ground reflected the moonlight and gave everything a pale blue, luminescence that was almost beautiful, the way dangerous things are often almost beautiful. Her breath made clouds that dissolved into the cold air. Her boots left clean prints in the untouched snow. She followed her compass and her father's maps and the particular quality of silence that she had learned, over years of reading his journals, to interpret as meaningful. He had written about the silence of the forest with a botanist's precision, distinguishing between the silence of nothing, present, and the silence of something very present and very still. She understood the difference now, moving between the trees, because the silence around her was the second kind, thick and watchful and aware. She found him 40 minutes into the forest, in the small clearing that her father's map marked with a symbol she had always interpreted as indicating importance, without understanding why. He was not a wolf. That was the first thing she registered, which was both a relief and a shock. Simultaneously, because she had prepared herself for an animal encounter, and what she found instead was a man, collapsed against the base of a massive pine tree, with his back against the bark and his legs stretched in front of him, at the angle of someone who had not chosen to sit down so much as simply stopped being able to stand. He was tall. She could tell even from the collapsed position, and broad-shouldered in a way that suggested the kind of physical presence that does not come from gyms or maintenance, but from something older and more fundamental. His dark hair was matted with what she realized was blood. His clothes were wrong for the weather, or rather, they were adequate for someone who did not feel cold the way ordinary people did, which was information she filed away automatically. His eyes were closed. She did not run. She stood at the edge of the clearing and assessed the situation with the same careful attention she had been trained by necessity to apply to things that most people would have fled from. He was injured. He was alone. He was in the exact location her father's map had marked as significant. She took 3 slow, deliberate breaths, feeling the cold air fill her lungs completely. And then she walked toward him and said, in a voice that was steadier than she felt, "I know what you are. I'm not afraid of you. And it looks like you need help." His eyes opened. They were amber, which was not a word Mara generally used to describe eye color because it sounded overwrought. but there was no other accurate word for what she was looking at. A warm, deep gold that caught the moonlight the way the eyes of animals catch light, with that additional reflective quality that has no name in human anatomy. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was impossible to read, not because it was blank, but because it contained too many things at once, the way a very old book sometimes opens to a page that is so dense with notation and annotation, and cross-referenced marginalia that it becomes briefly illegible before the eye learns how to enter it. Then he said, in a voice that was rough with what sounded like very long disuse, "You should be afraid of me." And she said, "I know. Are you going to hurt me?" And he said, after another pause that went on long enough for her to hear an owl somewhere in the trees above them, "No." That was how it began. Not with drama, not with supernatural displays or immediate revelations, but with two people in a snowy clearing having the most honest conversation either of them had managed in a very long time, which was something of a miracle given that one of them had been alive for approximately 3 centuries, and the other had spent her entire life preparing for this moment without ever being entirely sure the moment would come. Mara sat down in the snow across from him, because she was not going to crouch or hover like someone prepared for flight, and she opened her bag and took out the medical kit she had packed along with everything else, and she said, "Tell me where you're hurt and let me see if I can help." He told her. It was a wound in his side that would have killed a human being quickly and efficiently, but which was already beginning to close with the particular efficiency of a body that knew how to heal itself, given enough time and enough stillness. She cleaned it anyway, working with practical competence while he watched her with those amber eyes and said nothing. If he was surprised by her steadiness, he did not show it. If she was terrified by his proximity, she did not show it either. They were, in that particular way, well matched from the very beginning. His name was Cassian, and he did not offer it immediately. She had to ask, which was itself a small revelation, because the legends about the cursed wolf had never given him a name, had referred to him only by what he was rather than who he had been, and the fact that he still had a name, that he still thought of himself as possessing one, told her something important about the nature of the curse and the nature of the man underneath it. He said his name like someone testing whether it still fit, the way you try on an old coat to see if it still belongs to you. And when she said it back to him, repeated it simply and without elaboration, something in his face changed in a way that was very small and very significant. She noticed. She noticed everything. That was what a lifetime of paying attention to things other people dismissed had given her. A capacity for observation so finely calibrated that she sometimes felt like she was watching the world through a lens that was slightly more powerful than the one most people had access to. If you are finding this story as compelling as we hope you are, now would be a wonderful moment to hit the like button and let us know in the comments what you think Mara should do next, because the choices ahead of her are not simple ones, and we would love to hear your perspective before we continue. She did not bring him back to town that night. That would have been impossible on multiple levels, not least because Cassian was not capable of traveling the distance in his current condition, and because introducing a bloodied, amber-eyed, centuries-old cursed werewolf to the community of Veldmore without significant preparation seemed like the kind of decision that could not be undone once made. Instead, she went back home, moving through the forest with a deliberateness that kept fear at the edges of her awareness rather than at the center of it, retrieved supplies that a person could reasonably need for an extended period of cold weather camping, told Petra through a carefully worded text message that she was fine, but would be staying in the forest for a few days doing research, which Petra received with exactly the kind of measured understanding that made Mara grateful for her, and went back to the clearing. Cassian was where she had left him. He did not seem surprised that she had returned, which was either because he had expected it, or because he had learned not to expect anything, and had therefore released the habit of surprise entirely. She built a fire, which he watched with an expression she could not yet read, and set up the compact camping setup she had brought, and they spent the night in a proximity that was not comfortable exactly, but was genuine, which was better. She asked him about the disappearances on the second night, when his wound was healing more visibly, and he had accepted water and the food she offered, with something that was beginning to approach willingness rather than purely mechanical necessity. She asked directly, because she did not know how to ask things any other way and had stopped trying to develop that skill long ago. She said, "There are people missing from town. Fenbauer and Aldous Mertens. Do you know what happened to them?" And she watched his face very carefully as she asked, because she needed to know if she had been wrong about him. If her father's journals and her own years of research had led her to a conclusion that was wishful rather than accurate. If the distinction she had built her understanding on, between the beast the curse had made and the man the curse had imprisoned, was a distinction she had invented out of longing rather than evidence. Cassian looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "I did not take them." He said it simply, without the defensive elaboration of someone trying to convince, which was itself a form of evidence. He said, "I know who did. I have known for years and have not been able to stop it because the curse limits what I can do and where I can go. The people who built this town built it on an agreement with something older and more harmful than a wolf, and they have maintained that agreement through every generation by feeding it. And they hide what they feed it by letting the legend of the cursed wolf take the blame." He stopped speaking and looked at his hands for a moment, and then he looked back up at her. "Your father knew. He came close to understanding the whole of it. That is why they made sure he went into the forest and did not come back." The fire between them crackled and settled. Mara heard her own heartbeat, which was very steady, steadier than she would have predicted. She had thought in the part of herself that had been braced for the worst for most of her adult life, that the hardest thing would be finding proof that the wolf existed. She had not prepared herself adequately for the possibility that finding the wolf would reveal something infinitely worse about the people she had grown up beside. She said, "Tell me everything." And Cassian, who had been silent and alone for 300 years, and who had perhaps been waiting for exactly this specific combination of willingness and capability, did. The story he told her stretched across the entire night, because it was 3 centuries long, and because he told it carefully, distinguishing between what he had witnessed directly and what he had pieced together over years of observation from the margins, crediting his sources and acknowledging his uncertainties with an intellectual honesty that surprised her, and then stopped surprising her, because she understood gradually that this was who he had been before the curse, a man who had valued accuracy, who had been trained to document rather than to embellish, who had cared about the difference between what was true and what was useful. The original Cassian, the alpha of the pack that had occupied this territory 300 years before Veldmore had been founded over its ruins, had been many things, and not all of them were things she could admire without qualification. He told her this without prompting, because he had apparently spent 3 centuries becoming very clear about the difference between what he had done and what had been done to him. And he seemed to understand that she would not accept a version of the story that made him entirely a victim. He had led his pack with a combination of strength and blindness that he described with a precision that sounded like it had been refined through hundreds of revisitings, the language of a man who has examined his own past failures so many times that he has arrived at something beyond guilt, something that is more like a complete and unflinching map. He had been strong. He had been capable. He had genuinely believed that the hierarchy he enforced was natural and necessary, that the system that placed alphas at the top and treated omegas as resources to be allocated rather than people to be consulted was simply the order of things, the way reality was organized at a level too fundamental to question. He had not been cruel exactly, in the way that cruelty requires intent. He had been indifferent, which in some ways is harder to forgive because it does not even offer the courtesy of engagement. He had enforced rules that broke people without examining why the rules existed. He had benefited from suffering he did not cause directly but sustained through his participation and his silence, and his willingness to mistake the suffering of others for the natural order of the world. And then he had met Senna. She told her story the way myths always contain the woman at the center of the turning, which is to say she was present everywhere and named rarely. But Cassian said her name, with a weight that was 3 centuries old and still had not worn smooth, the way some stones in rivers resist the current and keep their edges, And Mara understood that Senna was not a villain in this story, and was not a victim either, but was something more complicated and more important. She was the person who had finally told the truth about what Cassian's leadership meant for the people he led. She was an Omega. She was brilliant and furious and precise, and she had come to Cassian not with a petition or a plea, but with documentation, the same kind of careful, irrefutable documentation that Mara's father had spent his life compiling about the legend, because some people in every generation are made to be witnesses and recorders and bringers of evidence that cannot be ignored. Cassian had ignored it, not completely and not maliciously, but he had looked at what she showed him. The records of Omegas forced into arrangements they had not chosen, the accounting of resources, systematically diverted away from the lower ranks of the hierarchy, the pattern of harm that was as clear as a map once someone took the trouble to draw it. And he had said that change of that magnitude had to happen slowly, that there were larger considerations, that stability was its own form of kindness, that she had to understand how things worked before she could understand why they had to work that way. He had said all the things that people who are comfortable within unjust systems say when someone inconvenient enough to care arrives with proof that the system is causing harm. He had said them with complete sincerity and no malice, and all the conviction of someone who has never had to pay the costs of the system he defends. And Senna had listened to him, and then she had looked at him for a long, quiet moment. And then she had said, "I gave you a chance to be better than what you are. You chose not to take it." And she had cursed him. But this, Cassian told Mara in the firelight, was not where the story ended, and it was not even the worst thing. The worst thing was what came after. What had moved into the vacuum left by the curse. A group of human settlers who had been watching the Pack's territory for years, waiting for an opportunity, who had carried with them an entity that they had made an agreement with. An old hunger that wore different faces in different eras, but which was always essentially the same thing. Always the same trade of human lives for human power. They had driven out the surviving Pack members, claimed the territory, built a town over the ruins of what had been there before, and established a founding covenant with the old hunger that had served their descendants very well for 300 years. Every generation, the hunger required feeding. Every generation, the town's leadership arranged for someone to disappear. And every generation, when questions were asked, the legend of the cursed wolf was available as an explanation. A convenient monster in the forest to absorb the accusations that might otherwise have landed somewhere much closer to home. Mara sat with all of this for a long time after he finished speaking. The fire had burned down to coals. The sky above the trees was beginning to lighten from black to the particular deep blue that comes before dawn. She thought about Sheriff Heiss and his careful, practiced reassurances. She thought about the town council, the same families in the same seats. For 300 years, the kind of institutional continuity that gets called tradition and celebrated at Founding Day festivals. She thought about Fen, 19 years old, and Aldous, who had walked home alone from a bar. She thought about her father, who had gotten too close to the truth and had been arranged out of the way with the same efficiency. She thought about the 14 journals and everything they contained, all the careful documentation, all the evidence that had seemed to be about a wolf and was actually about a town. Then she said, "We have to stop it." And Cassian said, "Yes." And she said, "Can the curse be broken?" And he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Senna's descendants carry the only thing that can break it. The curse was never meant to be permanent. She built a door into it. She just never found anyone she trusted enough to give the key to." And Mara said, very quietly, understanding arriving the way it always arrived for her, completely and all at once, rather than gradually. What was her last name? The answer was Voss. If this revelation just hit you the way we hope it did, please subscribe if you have not already and ring the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one, because this is only the beginning of what Mara and Cassian are going to uncover together. The days that followed were the most intensive research period of Mara's life, which was saying something considerable given that she had spent most of her adult life in a state of ongoing intensive research. She could not go back to the archive immediately, because going back to Veldmore meant going back to the sightlines of people who might have noticed her extended absence, and who might have reasons she now understood much better to want to know what she had been doing in the forest. She worked instead from her father's journals, and from her own memory of the archive's holdings, which was comprehensive enough that she could navigate it without being physically present. She asked Cassian questions with the systematic thoroughness of someone who is trying to build a complete picture from fragments, and he answered with the same systematic thoroughness. And gradually, over the course of those days in the clearing, a picture assembled itself that was both worse than she had expected and more actionable than she had feared. The town's founding documents, the ones displayed in the archive's main room in their archival frames with the preservation, glass and the small informational plaques, contained within their formal legal language, the traces of something that had been very carefully obscured, but not quite successfully erased. Her father had noted several anomalies in those documents years ago, inconsistencies in the dates and in the witnessing signatures that suggested the official versions were not the original versions. The originals, Cassian believed, still existed, because the old hunger required that the original agreement be maintained, required that the covenant be a living document rather than a historical artifact, which meant it had to be kept somewhere accessible and intact. He believed it was beneath the town hall, in a part of the building that had been there since the founding, and that the current leadership referred to as structural storage, which was a description designed to discourage investigation through boredom. Cassian's mobility was still limited by the curse, which bound him to the forest's boundaries with the mechanical precision of an enchantment designed by someone who thoroughly understood both the terrain and the nature of what she was containing. But his limitation was Mara's freedom. She could move through the town without restriction. She had access to the archive. She had, more importantly, the kind of social invisibility that comes from having been regarded as harmlessly eccentric for long enough that people have stopped paying real attention to what you do, which was a kind of protection she had never valued until now. And she had the journals, which were not just documentation but a map, her father's 30 years of getting closer and closer to a truth that had ultimately cost him his life, laid out in his precise handwriting for her to follow the rest of the way. She went back to town on the 5th day, walking out of the forest in the early morning when the streets were still mostly empty, slipping into her house through the back door and spending 2 hours, reading the most recent entries in the journal she had not yet fully processed, the one her father had been writing in the year he died. She had avoided those entries for years, not because she did not want to know what was in them, but because she had understood instinctively that they contained the information that would require her to act, and she had not felt ready to act until now. She felt ready now. She read the entries with a completeness of attention that left no room for grief or fear, filing both away for later, for the time after this was over, when she would presumably have the luxury of feeling things at their full volume again. The entries confirmed most of what Cassian had told her, and added specific details that only someone with physical access to the town's records would have been able to document. Her father had found the founding covenant. He had not been able to retrieve it, but he had photographed it, and the photographs were in an envelope tucked into the back cover of the journal, which was such a pure example of her father's systematic thoroughness that she felt something crack in her chest as she pulled the envelope out and carefully opened it. The photographs were small and slightly blurry but legible, showing pages of dense, archaic script alongside what appeared to be a seal pressed in something that was not wax, and was not any ordinary material she could identify from the photograph. She could read enough of the script to understand that Cassian had been accurate about the covenant's nature, and about the specific demands it placed on the town's leadership class. Demands that were so explicit and so monstrous, written out in the careful legal language of people who wanted to be very clear about the terms of a transaction, that she sat with the photographs for several minutes without moving. She scanned the photographs using the archive's equipment that afternoon, creating digital copies that she uploaded to 3 separate, secure cloud locations and emailed to an academic contact at a university in a larger city, a folklorist who had published papers about Veldmore's founding mythology and who had always taken Mara's contributions to those conversations with a seriousness that most people in town did not extend to her. She was not yet ready to make everything public, but she was making sure that the information existed in places beyond her reach and her father's journals, in places that would persist if something happened to her. She was not being paranoid. She was being exactly as careful as the situation required, which was very careful indeed. The process of building a case took 3 weeks, which felt both too long and not long enough. She moved between her house and the forest with a regularity that she explained to Petra as extended research projects, and Petra received these explanations with the serene acceptance of someone who has lived long enough to understand that some stories need to be finished before they can be explained. Cassian's wound healed completely in the first week, and with the return of his full physical capacity came a return of something else. A quality of presence that she had not fully appreciated when he was injured, and that she now found herself adjusting to with an awareness that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unwelcome. He was large and very still, in the way that things with a great deal of contained energy are still, and his amber eyes tracked everything that entered the clearing, and he listened to her reports on what she was finding in the archive with an intensity of attention that she recognized because she had it herself, that complete forward lean of a person for whom information is not abstract, but urgently real. She noticed other things, too, in those 3 weeks. She noticed that he had opinions, that the centuries of silence had not eroded his capacity to engage with ideas, but had in some ways sharpened it, the way a blade kept in careful storage holds its edge better than one that is used carelessly. He was funny, occasionally, in the dry, precise way of someone who has had a very long time to notice how absurd things are. He was patient with her when she thought out loud, which she did frequently, following the thread of an idea through all its tangents before arriving at the point. And his patience was not the passive kind that is really just waiting for someone to finish, but the active kind that follows. The thread alongside you, and sometimes sees where it is going before you do. She noticed that he was careful with her in ways that had nothing to do with her physical safety, careful with the information he shared, giving her time to process before adding more, checking that she was all right in ways that were not intrusive, but were genuine. He had had 300 years to think about what he wished he had done differently, and one of the things he had clearly identified was the failure to pay attention to the actual interior state of the people around him. And he was paying attention now with a thoroughness that was occasionally overwhelming. She told him one evening, when the fire was bright and the snow outside the clearing was falling in soft straight lines that meant the wind had died, that she had been lonely most of her life. She said it as a fact, simply, without the apologetic wrapping that most people apply to admissions like that one, because she had learned that apologizing for accurate statements was a form of dishonesty she did not have patience for. She said, "I grew up believing something that nobody around me believed, and that creates a particular kind of loneliness that is hard to explain to people who have not experienced it, because it is not just about being alone, but about being in a permanent state of dissonance, always translating between what you know and what the world insists is true." Cassian listened to all of this, and then he said, "I know something about that. The curse was not just physical containment. It was the impossibility of communication, the inability to tell anyone what I was seeing, what I had come to understand. I watched people being harmed for 300 years by something I could have named and could not reach anyone to name it to." He paused. "Until you." She looked at him across the fire, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything else about it that night. But something shifted between them that had the quality of a door opening very quietly in a house that had been closed for a long time. Tell us in the comments if you have ever believed in something that the people around you dismissed, and how that felt, because Mara's story is one that many of you are going to recognize in ways that go beyond the supernatural elements. She found the original covenant on a Tuesday evening in December, which was not a full moon night, but which had the kind of crystalline cold clarity that makes everything feel significant regardless. She had gained access to the structural storage beneath the town hall through a combination of the archive key she legitimately held and a secondary lock that she had been able to identify from her father's notes as using an antique lock mechanism that had a reliable bypass if you knew about it and had the right thin piece of metal, which she did because her father had documented exactly this in one of the earlier journals alongside a small diagram that had clearly been drawn with the intent of passing the information to someone who might need it. The storage was exactly as described: old stone walls, low ceiling, the kind of institutional neglect that accumulates in spaces that nobody visits, and in a sealed alcove behind what appeared to be a structural support wall, but was actually a door with a concealed hinge. She found what she was looking for. The covenant was kept in a case that she recognized immediately as something outside ordinary material reality, a container that felt wrong in the way that things feel wrong when the rules that normally apply are being suspended locally. It was not locked in any mechanical sense. It was kept by something that recognized wrongness of purpose and responded to it, which meant that someone who came to destroy it would find it inaccessible in a way that someone who came to understand it would not. She understood, from her father's journals and from Cassian's explanations, that this was not a coincidence of design, but a specific feature, because the entity that had written the covenant had been old enough and clever enough to understand that the most durable protection is not physical, but intent-based. She came to understand it. She opened the case. She read the covenant completely, standing in the cold storage room with her flashlight creating a small circle of visibility in the darkness, reading 300 years of careful, monstrous record-keeping with the same complete attention she had given to everything else in this process. She took the covenant. She also took the secondary record she found beneath it, which was the original version of the founding documents that the official copies in the archive's main room had been edited to obscure, and which contained the names, the specific names and signatures of the founding families, and every generation of leadership that had participated in and continued the covenant. The names were familiar. They were the names on the town hall's dedication plaques, and the Heritage Committee rolls, and the Founding Day Festival programs. They were names that she had grown up hearing as shorthand for civic virtue and community leadership. She put everything in her bag and walked out of the storage room and out of the town hall and into the cold night air, and she allowed herself one complete minute of something that was not quite fear and not quite rage, but contained elements of both, before she put it away and walked toward the forest. Cassian knew something had changed before she said anything. He was standing at the edge of the clearing when she arrived, which she had never seen before, always having found him seated or moving within the space, and he watched her cross the snow toward him with an expression that was reading her the same way she had learned to read him. That mutual calibration of people who have become accustomed to paying each other real attention. She said, "I found it. I have everything." He said, "Are you all right?" And she considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to treat it, and said, "Not entirely, but I'm ready." He nodded, and then he said, "Mara," and the way he said her name was different from how anyone else said it, had been different from the first time, carrying something that she was going to have to find words for eventually. The breaking of the curse required specificity that she had spent the previous weeks preparing for. Senna's design, elegant in the way that things designed by people who are both furious and precise tend to be elegant, required 3 components: the covenant destroyed, the original truth spoken aloud in the place where the lie had been built, and the willing acknowledgement of the one who had been cursed. The third component was the one that Cassian had been unable to fulfill alone, because the acknowledgement required a witness who understood what was being acknowledged. A witness from Senna's bloodline who could hear it and verify it and accept it as sufficient for the purpose of release. She was that witness. She had always been going to be that witness. The whole architecture of the past 300 years, looking at it now with the covenant in her bag and the full picture assembled at last, had the shape of something moving toward a specific point, not predestined, her father had been careful to note in his journals, because predestination removes agency, and agency was the entire point. Senna had not designed a fate, but an opportunity, a door that required the right person to choose to open it. They built the fire larger than usual that night. She spread the covenant pages carefully and let them burn one by one, reading each one aloud before the flames took it, speaking the names and the terms, and the record of 300 years of harm into the cold night air, naming what had been done and by whom. Cassian stood beside her through all of it, when the last page was ash. She turned to him, and he began to speak the acknowledgement that Senna's curse had always required. He spoke for a long time, and she listened without interrupting. And what he said had the quality of something that had been kept at enormous pressure for 300 years, and was finally being released into the open air where it could disperse and become something else. He did not perform contrition. He spoke truth, which is harder and more useful, accounting for what he had done and what he had failed to do, and what he understood now that he had not understood then, and what he intended, if released, to do with that understanding. He looked at her throughout, holding the contact the way a person holds a rope across water, and she looked back at him and held it too. When he finished, she said, "I hear you. I accept this as sufficient." And the curse broke. It broke the way old things break, not dramatically, not with visible special effects, but with a deep subterranean shift that she felt in her chest and her bones and the base of her skull, like a frequency that had been present for so long she had stopped noticing it, and now was absent, and the absence was louder than the presence had been. Cassian stood very still for a moment, and then something in his posture changed. Some held tension that she had not consciously identified as tension until it was gone, and he looked like himself but differently, the way a photograph looks different when you finally see it in good light after having seen it only in dim light for so long that you thought you understood what it showed. He looked at her. She looked at him. The fire between them had burned down again, as it had on the first night, to the particular soft glow of coals rather than flame. She said, "How do you feel?" And he said, "Like myself, for the first time in 300 years, like myself." And she felt something in her chest that was warm and large and a little terrifying, which she had been feeling for weeks in small increments and which was now arriving at full volume and refusing to be filed away for later. She said, "Good," which was completely inadequate to the situation and somehow exactly right. And he made a sound that she recognized as the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him, which was also exactly right. Now, if you are emotionally invested in these two, in a way that means you need to know what happens next immediately, you are in the right place. And a quick subscription will make sure you never miss another story in this series. What happened next was not immediate, which was appropriate, given the scale and age of everything that had just changed. What came immediately was the other half of the work, the part that took place in the visible world, rather than the private world of cleared forests and ancient covenants and broken enchantments. Mara had the evidence. She had the documents, the covenant, the original founding records, the photographs her father had taken, the digital copies she had already distributed to people outside Veldmore who could not be pressured into silence. She had the academic contact at the university, who had by now responded to the materials she had sent with an email that was 7 paragraphs long and whose general emotional register could be summarized as stunned excitement and immediate professional mobilization. She had Petra, who knew enough of the broader picture to be a credible witness to Mara's state of mind and the arc of her research over years. And she had Cassian, who was no longer bound to the forest. The process of dismantling 300 years of institutional corruption was not swift, and she would not have wanted it to be, because swift dismantling tends to leave the underlying structures intact and simply replace the people at the top, rather than examining what made the structure capable of containing what it had contained. She went to the regional authorities, not Sheriff Heiss, whom she bypassed with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood exactly where his loyalties lay, but the regional office that Heiss had previously failed to engage meaningfully. She brought documentation. She brought her university contact, who brought institutional credibility and the particular kind of media attention that comes from academic experts, publicly calling for investigation, rather than random concerned citizens. She was patient. She was meticulous. She was infuriating to every official who tried to manage her down or redirect her, or suggest that her evidence was preliminary, and required further expert review, because she had already done the expert review herself, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Fen and Aldous were found alive. That was the detail she had not allowed herself to hope for too specifically, because hope of that specificity is dangerous when the outcome is uncertain. But they were found in the course of the investigation's first formal search of locations indicated by the Covenant's records, and while they required significant medical and psychological support, and the road back to themselves was going to be long and non-linear, they were alive. The old hunger, confronted with the destruction of the Covenant that had given it access to the town, had retreated with the self-preserving pragmatism of things that are primarily interested in survival rather than loyalty. When the agreement that had sustained its presence was gone, it simply withdrew, leaving behind only the people it had already taken and the damage already done. The founding families did not all behave the same way when the investigation closed in. Some attempted the specific kind of denial that requires maintaining eye contact and sounding very reasonable while saying things that are completely untrue, which worked for exactly as long as it took the investigators to review the documents and conduct the interviews that the documents made inevitable. Some retreated into procedural obstruction, calling lawyers and citing statutes and buying time in increments small enough to be individually dismissible but significant in aggregate. Sheriff Heiss resigned before the investigation formally named him, which was the coward's form of accountability, and which she noted without particular satisfaction, because resignation is not the same as reckoning. The families whose names were on the Covenant's participation records across the generations were subjected to the full scope of what a newly energized regional investigation with significant documentary evidence and external academic attention could bring to bear, which turned out to be considerably more than they had prepared for. She thought often during those months about Cassian's accounting, the speech he had made to break the curse. She thought about the distinction he had drawn between his silence and his malice, between the harm he had caused through indifference and the harm he had caused through active choice. And she thought about the founding families and their long transgenerational maintenance of something that could not be maintained without sustained active participation. And she understood that the accounting for institutional evil is always more complicated than the accounting for individual cruelty, because it involves so many people who told themselves they were simply maintaining what they had inherited, simply honoring the agreements of their predecessors, simply doing what had always been done. The complication does not reduce the harm. It makes it harder to address, without making it smaller. She kept that distinction in her mind as a working tool throughout the months of investigation, preventing herself from the too easy satisfactions of simple villains and their simple punishments. Cassian navigated the world outside the forest with the particular adaptation strategy of someone who has spent centuries observing human society from its margins, and now has to participate in it directly. He was, practically speaking, a man with no documentation who appeared to be in his mid-30s, and who had no verifiable history prior to the past several months, which was a specific kind of problem that turned out to be navigable through a combination of Mara's university contacts' institutional connections and the quiet assistance of people in the regional administration who were, by that point, interested in helping anyone who had been instrumental in exposing what had just been exposed. He was careful and systematic about learning the practical landscape of the contemporary world, applying the same thorough attention to the task that he seemed to apply to everything, and Mara found herself in the unexpected role of primary guide to 3 centuries of accumulated change, which was a project that produced some of the best conversations she had ever had, because Cassian's combination of vast historical context and genuine curiosity about everything he had missed made him an extraordinary person to explain things to. She found, in those months, that the loneliness she had described to him on the night of the falling snow was not simply diminishing, but actively transforming into its opposite. It was not just that she was no longer alone, though she was no longer alone. It was that she was for the first time in her life consistently understood, which is different from being agreed with and different from being loved, though it turned out to coexist very naturally with both. He understood why she cared about things with the intensity she cared about them. He understood the particular combination of patience and urgency that characterized her relationship with information. He understood the cost of being the person who keeps the record when everyone else has agreed to forget, because he had been keeping a record too, in the only way available to him, the long, faithful record of a witness who cannot yet speak, but will not stop watching. She fell in love with him the way she fell into understanding things generally, all at once and completely. arriving at a conclusion that felt like it had been true for some time, and she had simply been in the process of recognizing it. She did not make a production of it. She told him on an evening in early spring when they were in the house, which he now shared with her in the practical, unsentimental way that two people with a great deal of work to do naturally share space with each other. And she told him because she believed in accuracy, and the accurate description of the situation was that she loved him. He listened to her say it, and then he looked at her for a moment, with that expression she had learned to read over the months of learning him, the one that contained too many things at once, and was only legible once you knew what you were looking for. And then he said, "I know. I have been trying to work out how to tell you the same thing," without making it sound like 300 years of solitude were simply a waiting room for this specific conversation, which is both true and seems like an unfair amount of pressure to put on one person. And she said, "I can handle the pressure." And he said, "Yes, I know that too." The spring brought Veldmore through the opening months of a thorough institutional reckoning that would take years to fully complete, because that is the nature of institutional reckoning. It does not resolve in a single dramatic moment, but unfolds in the slow accumulation of policy changes and personnel changes and structural changes, and the harder to measure but more fundamental change in what a community believes it is and what it owes its members. Mara was part of that process, named as both lead researcher and key witness in multiple aspects of the investigation, and she found in that role a version of the purpose she had always been reaching toward, the application of all those years of paying attention to something that the world was ready to receive. The archive where she worked was reorganized under new direction, the new director being a woman from outside Veldmore, who had been brought in specifically because the investigation had made clear that institutional memory needed stewardship by someone with no inherited investment in the institutional mythology, and who turned out to share enough of Mara's instincts about documentation and truth-telling to make the working relationship productive from the first week. Petra came to dinner often that spring, because she was old and had been waiting for this story to finish for longer than Mara had been alive. And she had opinions about all of it that were worth hearing. And she liked Cassian with the uncomplicated directness of someone who has lived long enough to recognize character when she encounters it without needing the surrounding narrative to validate her assessment. She told him once, over a meal that Mara had cooked, with the same systematic competence she brought to everything, and that had come out very well, that he reminded her of Mara's father. And when both of them looked at her with the questioning attention this observation warranted, she said, "He was also someone who had spent too long alone with an important truth, and had finally found someone to tell it to. He was also someone who loved my Mara very much. The first time I saw him hold her as an infant, I thought, this is a man who will do anything for this child. And I was right, and I was wrong, because what he chose to do was follow the truth to its end, rather than stay safe. And that broke her heart, but it also built her into everything she is. I miss him." She said all of this very matter-of-factly, and then ate a bite of potato and looked at neither of them, which was the right call. Mara thought about her father a great deal in those months, which was both inevitable and, for the first time, bearable in a way it had not previously been. She had spent years with grief wrapped around the guilt of not having been able to save him, not having known enough in time, not having been old enough or informed enough when he died to do anything with what she had inherited from him. She understood now that this was not how he had seen it, that the journals were not a burden passed to her in default, but a trust deliberately given, a baton handed in full confidence that she would know what to do with it when the time came. He had been right. She had known. It had taken every one of the years between his death and this spring, and it had required a great deal of loss and loneliness, and sustained faith in something that the world insisted was not real. But she had known. She visited the forest sometimes in the evenings, going to the place where the path from the edge of the trees toward the clearing began, and stood there for a few minutes in the way that people stand in places where they have experienced something irreversible. She did not grieve less. She carried the grief differently. Please take a moment right now to share this story with someone you know who loves a good supernatural romance with real emotional depth. Because stories like this one find their audience one person at a time, and every share makes a difference. The summer was long and warm in a way that Veldmore's summers rarely were, as if the season was participating in the general sense of things opening up that had characterized the whole year since the Covenant's destruction. Mara noted this with the same attention she gave to everything, not attributing causation, but allowing correlation its due. She and Cassian had established a rhythm of life together that was practical and companionable and punctuated by the kind of conversations that she had previously thought only happened in books, the ones that go on for hours and change the shape of the things you thought you understood. He was learning the present century with an appetite that she found delightful in the specific way that watching someone discover something you have always taken for granted is delightful, presenting it back to you made new by the fact of their genuine first encounter with it. She was learning things from him that had no contemporary equivalent, knowledge that had existed in a person for 300 years and was now available to be passed on, slowly and specifically, to someone who would know how to keep it. The university had expressed strong interest in Cassian's account of the period before Veldmore's founding, the pre-colonial pack culture that the town had been built over, and that had been systematically erased from the official record along with everything else the founding covenant had required to be concealed. This was a complicated negotiation, because historical accuracy and personal privacy and the rights of oral tradition versus documented scholarship all had legitimate claims on the same material, and working out a form that honored all of them required exactly the kind of careful, sustained engagement that neither of them found particularly challenging, and both found genuinely interesting. The folklorist from the university came to Veldmore in July and spent a week in careful conversation with both of them, emerging with a preliminary framework for an approach that Mara thought had a real chance of being something she could fully endorse, which was not something she said about many proposed scholarly frameworks. The folklorist, whose name was Dr. Helena Varn, and who had the quality that the best academics have of being unable to pretend to believe things they do not actually believe, looked at Cassian with an expression of barely contained professional excitement and said, "You understand that you are the single most extraordinary primary source in the history of this field." He said, "I understand." She said, "How do you want to be known?" He thought about it for a moment and said, "Accurately." She looked at Mara. Mara looked back at her. They were both smiling. Autumn arrived, and with it the anniversary of the first disappearance. Fenn's disappearance, the one that had started the sequence that had brought Mara to the edge of the forest with her father's coat and her father's map. Fenn was in recovery, which was a word that both described something real and inevitably undersold how much was contained in it, the non-linear, difficult, ongoing work of returning to a life. That had been interrupted by something that had no adequate frame. He had, in the preceding months, asked to meet Mara, and then asked to meet Cassian, which they had understood as his way of trying to place what had happened to him in a framework large enough to hold it. Both meetings had been careful and honest, and had involved Mara describing in as much detail as Fenn wanted the full history of what the town had been built on and what had been done to maintain it, because she believed that people who have been harmed by systems deserve to understand the systems that harmed them, and Fenn had the same quality of wanting accurate information that she recognized as a form of resilience she had seen before. He was going to be all right, not unchanged, not unaffected, but all right in the deeper sense, the sense that mattered more. Aldous was doing something similar and different, because trauma individuates even when its sources are shared, and her path back was taking a shape that was specifically hers, which Mara respected from a distance and was available to if called upon. She had not been called upon yet, and had begun to understand that this too was information, that Aldous' process was private in a way that Fenn's had not been, and that privacy was its own form of resilience, and should be met with the same respect as the more visible kind. She thought about this distinction often, the visible and invisible forms of recovery, the public accounting and the private healing, the systems that needed dismantling, and the people who needed tending, and how the work of justice and the work of care were not the same work even when they were aimed at the same harm. On the anniversary night, she and Cassian went to the clearing. Not to commemorate exactly, because commemoration implies a finished thing, and this was not finished, would not be finished for years, possibly generations, certainly not within the scope of any single story. They went because the clearing was where the turning had begun, where she had found him, and he had found her, and it seemed right to mark the year by returning to the place where the work had started. The fire was smaller than it had been on that first night, which was appropriate, because they were warmer than they had been then. The sky above the trees was the same sky it always was over the forest, immense and cold and indifferent in the way that wild things are indifferent, without cruelty and without comfort, simply present and vast and genuinely beautiful, if you could look at it without needing it to be anything other than what it was. He told her, sitting beside her in the clearing with the fire between them, as it had been that first night, but with none of the distance and all of the warmth that had accumulated between then and now, that he had been afraid she would not come back. That first night, when she had returned to town for supplies, and he had sat in the snow and the cold with his wound, and his 3 centuries, and waited to find out whether she would return. He had been afraid she would not because he had not believed her, but because he was old enough to understand that good intentions and brave choices are real, and still do not always win against fear and comfort and the weight of everything ordinary pulling toward the known. He had sat in the snow, and he had been afraid in a way he had not felt capable of being afraid in a very long time, because being afraid requires having something to lose, and he had spent 3 centuries systematically losing everything until there was nothing left to lose. And then she had come, and suddenly there was something to lose again, and that was both terrible and necessary, and the most alive he had felt since before the curse. She listened to all of this, and felt the full weight of it, and then said, "I was always coming back." He said, "I know that now." She said, "I knew it then." He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him, and the fire settled between them into coals, which was where all good fires eventually arrive, past the drama of the initial flame into the deeper and more enduring heat that holds through the long cold hours. She was not the girl who had grown up believing in a story nobody else believed. She was not only the daughter of a man who had died following the truth to its end. She was not only the last of Senna's line, or the researcher, or the witness, or the woman who had walked into a forest at nightfall with a compass and her father's coat. She was all of those things, and also herself, fully and specifically herself, which she had been all along, but which she could now inhabit without apology, without the low-grade static of permanent dissonance between what she knew and what the world insisted. The world had caught up. Or rather, she had brought the world to where the truth was, which was the same thing looked at from a different angle, and Cassian, who had been the cursed wolf and, before that, a man who had made serious mistakes from a position of serious power and who had spent 3 centuries in the particular purgatory of someone who has been punished in ways that illuminate rather than simply hurt, who had watched and learned and understood and been unable until now to do anything with the understanding. He was free, not simply of the curse, which was a specific and remarkable thing, but of the weight of the unreceived accounting, the reckoning that had been building for 300 years and had now been witnessed and accepted and released. He was free in the way that genuine accountability makes a person free, not the cheap freedom of avoiding consequences, but the real freedom of having faced what there was to face and come through. It changed in the necessary ways. He sat beside her in the clearing where it had begun, and felt the cold air and the warmth of the fire, and the specific gravity of her presence beside him, which was unlike anything he had felt in his long life, and which he was not going to take for granted, because 300 years of knowing what it is to lose everything is a very thorough education in the importance of not taking anything for granted. The forest was quiet around them, not the silence of nothing, but the silence of everything at rest. The snow would come again in a few weeks, the winter cycle beginning once more, but this winter would be different from the ones before it, different in the way that everything is. Different, once the truth has been spoken, and the old agreements have been burned, and the people who were supposed to protect a community are being held accountable for what they actually did. The covenant was ash. The hunger it had sustained was gone. The forest was only a forest, deep and old and full of its own life, indifferent to human stories, but available to be moved through by people who approach it with respect and adequate preparation, and the willingness to find what is actually there, rather than what they expected. She leaned against him, which was something she had started doing some weeks ago, and which both of them had recognized without discussion as a particular kind of statement, the language of proximity used fluently by people who have learned each other well enough to communicate in it. He put his arm around her, which was the response that the language required, and they sat like that in the clearing where it had begun, watching the coals and the dark between the trees and the particular way the light from the fire touched the snow, and did not feel the need to add anything to what was already present. Tomorrow there would be more work. There would always be more work. The systems that had allowed the Covenant to operate for 300 years were not fully dismantled by a single investigation, however thorough, and the people who had been harmed by those systems deserved more than the satisfaction of exposure, deserved the slower and more difficult work of rebuilding in a way that built differently. She was already thinking about it, had been thinking about it for months, had a list in her father's most recent journal, written in her own hand in the margins of his last entries, of everything that needed to change, and how she thought it might be changed, and who might be the right people to be part of changing it. The list was long. She was not daunted by it. She had never been someone who was daunted by long lists of important things, which was perhaps the most fundamental thing about her, and the thing that made everything else she was capable of possible. But tonight was tonight. The anniversary of the beginning. The fire and the clearing and the two of them on the other side of everything that the year had required of them. She listened to the silence of the forest and felt his warmth beside her, and thought of her father, who had loved her enough to leave her the map, and of Senna, who had been furious enough and precise enough and hopeful enough to build a door into a curse because she believed that someone would eventually be worthy of walking through it, and of the long thread of believing and documenting and paying attention that had brought her here, to this specific clearing, to this specific fire, to this specific life that was genuinely and completely and remarkably her own. This is where we leave them tonight. Not at an ending, because real stories do not end, but at a resting place, one of those moments where the accumulated weight of everything that has happened settles into something that can be held and recognized and valued before the next chapter of work begins. Mara Voss, who was the only one who still believed in the legend of the cursed wolf, found at the end of her believing not a myth, but a man, and found in that man a partner for the most important work of her life, and found in herself, through all of it, everything she had always been, and had simply needed the right circumstances to fully become. And Cassian, who had been the curse, and before that, the man who earned it, and before that, the man who might have been something better, and was now, at last, something better. He had been found, which was all any of us, in the end, are really hoping for. If this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about or something to feel, please like and subscribe and share it with someone who needs a story like this one today, because you never know who is sitting alone somewhere, believing in something the world has not yet caught up with, and sometimes the best thing you can do for a person like that is show them that the believing is worth it. We will see you in the next story.